Have you ever struggled to explain what BIM execution plan means to a new team member? Well, in this video, I'll be looking at some of the proposed terminology within the draft revisions of ISO 19650 and sharing some insight as to the rationale behind the proposals. As you may be aware, ISO released the draft revisions of ISO 19650 for public consultation. And one of the main areas that's up for debate is the proposed terminology. Now, terminology is always a big challenge when it comes to standards, so much so that the ISO subcommittee have even set up an international task force to oversee the terminology across all of the standards it produces, not just ISO 19650. Although their job is to provide guidance to the various working groups, not to make decisions, as the final authority still lies with the ISO subcommittee and the national standards bodies. There are a few reasons why the International Working Group are proposing to introduce some new terms within ISO 19650. Firstly, because they had to unify the terminology used in the existing parts 2 and 3, which differs slightly across the two standards. Secondly, because they wanted to make it easier for countries to translate the standards, based on feedback from those who found it difficult to translate the nuances within some of the terms, making it difficult for them to adopt. And finally, because they would like to remove the confusion around some of the terms, especially for those who are new to information management and the ISO 19650 standards. In the draft standards, you'll notice the few terms that the working group are proposing to revise for the reasons I've just mentioned. I'm not going to go through them all, but there are 3 terms I would like you to focus on, and that's management, production, and project, as these are 3 existing terms that form the basis of nearly all the proposed terms. The idea is that activities and outputs will be aligned to either information management or information production, and that information will be managed and produced during a project across all stages of the asset lifecycle. So let's look at each of these in turn. From a management perspective, the working group are proposing to add new outputs focusing on the information management activities to existing outputs like the information management assignment matrix. For example, an information management strategy at the organizational level would sit alongside and support the asset management strategy. Plus, an information management plan at the project level would outline how information is to be managed throughout the project. And to oversee the information management activities and outputs, the working group are also proposing to introduce an information management team at both the organizational and project level. The term production dates back to 2007, when BS 1192 was first published, a British standard entitled The Collaborative Production of Information, which was effectively part 1 of the UK 1192 series, upon which the ISO 19650 series is based. The term continued in ISO 19650 as Step 6 of the process in Part 2, which is also named the Collaborative Production of Information, and in Part 3, Step 6 of the process is named Production of Information. So the working group looked to simplify this to information production, which is now the proposed name of Step 8 in the unified process, and they're proposing to use this as a prefix for all the outputs that are used as inputs for information production activities, similar to the existing information production methods and procedures. So what will this look like in terms of the unified information management process? Well, for some outputs, it will simply be the introduction of the word production to make it more specific. For example, information standard, which contains all of the rules to be followed when information is produced, would become the information production standard. For others, it would replace similar terms like exchange, execution, and delivery to keep everything aligned. For example, information exchange requirements would become information production requirements, the requirements for the information to be produced. BIM execution plan would become information production plan, the plan for how the information will be produced during an appointment, whether that's using BIM or any other approach. And information delivery milestones would become information production milestones, the milestones against which information is to be produced, not just delivered. The working group are also proposing to extend this to team names as well, so delivery team would become information production team. In the existing standards, the term project is used extensively as the prefix to many of the outputs in Part 2 of ISO 19650, and in Part 3, this is replaced with the term asset. For example, in Part 2, you have the project information standard, and in Part 3, you have the asset information standard. Now, regardless of how well you define it, the term project is synonymous with the design and construction of new assets, or major refurbishments of existing assets. This presented a challenge to the working group, who had to unify the terms in both standards and to make them relevant to the whole of the asset lifecycle. So after considering various options and consulting with the terminology task force, the decision was to stick with the term project, but to make the distinction between an asset-related project, where an asset is created, refurbished, or maintained, and a project to manage and produce information, which can occur at any stage of the asset lifecycle. So you will see the terms asset-related project and project used throughout the draft standards, depending on which context it's in. So to summarise, the working group are proposing a clearer focus on the information management and information production activities and outputs, and a more precise use of the term project to make it relevant across the entire asset lifecycle. The consultation process is your opportunity to have a say in which terms are included in the standards. So I'd encourage you to share your thoughts through the commenting process.